The war in Spain was ending, though no one at Wraxall Park quite believed it yet, and the roads from Salisbury were still thick with the mud of a hard, late winter, when the news reached the house that Colonel Gideon Ashworth, Earl of Rothwell, was riding home at last, 5 years after he had left it in disgrace not his own. Lady Rosalind Wraxall heard it first from Sally, the upstairs maid, who had it from the baker's boy, who had it from a groom at the Rothwell stables 3 miles distant. For news in that part of Wiltshire travelled faster on foot than any express rider could manage, and by the time it reached the drawing-room where Rosalind sat with her needlework untouched in her lap, it had already acquired the particular shine of a story too remarkable not to improve in the telling. "They say he's been decorated by Lord Wellington himself, my lady," Sally said, eyes bright, "and that he's returning with a fortune in prize money from Vittoria, and that he means to open Rothwell Hall again after all these years, shut up and grieving." Rosalind said nothing for a long moment, her needle motionless above the linen. She was 23, dark-haired, quick-tempered when provoked, and otherwise admired for a composure that concealed, rather better than most people guessed, a heart that had never entirely recovered from the winter 5 years before, when Gideon Ashworth's father had been publicly ruined, and Gideon himself had bought a commission and left the county without so much as a farewell call at Wraxall Park, because by then the two families could no longer be seen to speak. "He is Earl now, then," she said finally. "His father is dead. These 2 years passed, my lady. Did you not know?" She had known. She had simply never permitted herself to dwell on what it might mean. Wraxall Park itself sat at the centre of 11,000 acres of Wiltshire downland, a great honey-coloured house of Queen Anne proportions that Rosalind's grandfather had built upon the ruins of an older manor. Its long gallery hung with family portraits going back 3 generations of Dukes of Wraxall, its park laid out by a fashionable designer 40 years before, in sweeping lawns, and a serpentine lake that froze, most winters thick enough for skating. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the great houses of the county, and it was also, Rosalind had come slowly to understand over the last several years, a house built as much upon its silences as upon its stone. Her father, Charles Wraxall, 6th Duke of Wraxall, was a man of considerable public dignity and private unease, a magistrate for the county, a man much consulted on matters of law and order, in a countryside grown restless with agricultural distress and the occasional midnight rick-burning that the newspapers were beginning to call, with some alarm, the doing of Luddite sympathisers, though Wiltshire's troubles were older and more particular than the northern mill disturbances the word properly described. He had grown greyer and more careful in the 5 years since the Ashworth affair, and though he never spoke of it directly, Rosalind had noticed that he flinched, faintly, whenever the name Rothwell was mentioned at his table. Her mother, the Duchess Margaret, was gentler in her unease, and it was she who first said, at breakfast, the morning after Sally's news had travelled the length of the servants' hall, and up the back stairs into every drawing-room in the county, "I understand the young Earl of Rothwell is expected home within the fortnight. I confess I do not know what your father means to do about it." "Do about it?" Rosalind asked. "Surely there is nothing to do. He is merely coming home to his own house." Her father, from behind his newspaper, said nothing at all, which was, Rosalind had learned over 23 years, very often the most eloquent thing he ever said. Viscount Harcourt arrived for dinner 3 days later, as he did most weeks now, since the understanding between their two families had been formed the previous autumn. An understanding that Rosalind had accepted with the same careful, dutiful resignation with which she accepted most of what her position required of her, and that she had not, until the news of Gideon Ashworth's return, examined very closely for what it actually asked her to give up. Frederick Harcourt was not an unhandsome man, nor an unkind one. He was 30, sandy-haired, possessed of an estate adjoining Wraxall Park's western boundary, and a father, the elder Viscount, whose own political ambitions in the county had made the match a matter of considerable satisfaction to both families. He spoke well, danced adequately, and had never once, in the 6 months of their understanding, said anything to Rosalind that she could later recall with any particular warmth. "I hear Rothwell means to return," Harcourt said over the soup, in the careless tone of a man remarking on the weather. Bold of him, given the circumstances of his father's departure from public life. I should have thought a family so thoroughly disgraced would prefer to remain quietly abroad. "His father is dead, my lord," Rosalind said, more sharply than she intended. "I imagine a son does not forfeit his home along with his father's grave." Harcourt glanced at her with mild surprise, as though a piece of furniture had spoken. "You are warm in his defence, Lady Rosalind, for a man you can barely have known these 5 years past." "I knew him rather better before those 5 years began," she said, and returned her attention to her soup before either her father or Harcourt could pursue the observation further, though she felt her father's gaze rest on her, heavy and unreadable for the remainder of the meal. She had known him, in truth, since they were children, for the Ashworth and Wraxall estates marched together along 3 miles of river, and Gideon, 4 years her senior, had taught her to ride astride rather than side-saddle when she was 11 and he 15, an offence for which both their mothers had scolded them roundly, and neither child had ever regretted. By the time she was 18 and he 22, newly down from Oxford and being groomed by his father for a seat in Parliament, something had grown between them that neither had yet found the courage to name aloud, though every servant on both estates had long since named it privately among themselves. Then had come the winter of 1809 and the ruin of Gideon's father. The elder Earl of Rothwell had been accused, on evidence that Rosalind had never fully understood, being then only 18 and shielded from the particulars, of financial improprieties connected to a county militia contract, improprieties that had cost him his seat, his reputation, and very nearly his liberty, and that had driven him to his grave within 18 months, a broken and humiliated man. Gideon, then 23, had watched his father's ruin with a fury Rosalind had glimpsed only once, on the last evening he had called at Wraxall Park before the two families' association was quietly, permanently severed. A fury directed, she had always privately suspected, at something beyond the mere facts of the accusation, though he had never said so plainly, not even to her. "I am going away," he had told her, standing in the same walled rose garden where, years later, other lovers in other stories might have stood beneath a winter moon, though that March evening had been mild and full of the smell of new grass. "There is nothing left for me here but my father's disgrace, and a county that will not look either of us in the eye. I will not ask you to wait for a man with no name left worth waiting for." "I would wait regardless," she had said, "if you would only ask it properly." "That," he had said with a bitterness she had never before heard in his voice, "is precisely why I cannot ask it at all." He had left within the week, purchased a commission and gone to the peninsula, and Rosalind had spent 5 years learning to build a life that did not depend on his return. It had not been an easy education. Dr. Aldous Fenn, who had attended the Wraxall family since before Rosalind was born, and who had a countryman's blunt way of speaking truths that more fashionable physicians left carefully unsaid, had told her mother once, within Rosalind's own overhearing, that grief long suppressed had a way of settling into the constitution like a low fever that never quite broke. And Rosalind, hearing it, had understood that he meant her, though neither of them ever spoke of it directly afterward. She had thrown herself instead into the ordinary business of a duke's daughter's life, the charitable visits to tenant cottages, the long afternoons of needlework and correspondence, the careful cultivation of a composure so complete that even Miss Prentice, who had governessed her from the age of 6 and knew her moods better than her own mother did, had begun to remark, with some private worry, that Lady Rosalind seemed to have grown old before her time. The Duke's study, on the evening after Harcourt's dinner, was a room Rosalind rarely entered uninvited, and so it was with some surprise that Higgins the butler found her there past midnight, standing before the cold hearth when he came to bank the fires a final time before retiring. "His Grace is not within, my lady," Higgins said in the careful, unplaceable tone of a servant who has learned over 30 years' service precisely how much of what he observes is his to remark upon. He rode out an hour past, toward the Rothwell boundary, and asked that no one wait up. Toward Rothwell at this hour? I could not say what business took him there, my lady. Only that he went in some haste and took nothing with him but a leather case from the locked drawer of that desk. Higgins nodded toward the great mahogany desk that dominated the room, and then, after a moment's visible hesitation that told Rosalind he had decided, against every instinct of his training, to say one thing more. "It is not my place, my lady, to speculate on his Grace's private affairs, but I have kept this house 40 years, and I have never once, in all that time, seen him ride out alone by night, in March weather, for any reason that did not touch very nearly upon this family's whole honour." He bowed and withdrew, and left Rosalind standing alone in the cold study with her father's locked drawer standing, for once, very slightly ajar. She did not open it. She told herself, standing there in the dark with her candle guttering, that whatever secret her father kept locked in that desk was not hers to take by theft. However, her whole body ached with the desire to know what business could possibly draw the Duke of Wraxall out into a bitter March night, alone, toward the very estate whose new master had just that week returned home to claim it. She closed the drawer herself quietly and went up to bed and did not sleep. It was 3 days later at the County Assembly Rooms in the town of Amesbury that she saw him again for the first time in 5 years. The assembly that spring was a modest affair by London standards, a country ball attended by perhaps 60 families of the district, held in rooms too small and too warmly candlelit for true elegance, but beloved regardless for being, as it was every year, the first proper gathering after the long isolation of winter. Rosalind had come with her parents and with Harcourt at her side, wearing a gown of pale blue silk that her mother had pronounced becoming, and that Rosalind herself found, that evening, curiously difficult to feel anything at all about. Then the doors opened and Colonel Gideon Ashworth, Earl of Rothwell, was announced, and the whole room turned as one, because everyone present had spent the last fortnight talking of nothing else, and because the man who walked into that low, candle-lit room bore so little resemblance to the furious, grieving young man who had left it 5 years before, that Rosalind felt, for one entire suspended moment, as though she were looking at a stranger wearing a face she had once known better than her own. The fiddlers, mid-reel, faltered and recovered. The dowagers along the wall leaned toward one another behind their fans. And Rosalind was aware with the particular sharpened attention of a woman determined not to appear to be watching something she could not stop watching, of every small detail of him. The new gravity in his bearing, a thin white scar along his jaw that had not been there 5 years before. The way he wore his decorations with the plain, unshowy correctness of a man who had earned them somewhere he did not care to discuss in a Wiltshire ballroom. He was broader through the shoulder than he had been, sun-browned despite the English winter, moving with the particular economy of a man long accustomed to command, and when his gaze found hers across the room, for it did find hers immediately, unerringly, as though 5 years and a war and an ocean had done nothing at all, to dull whatever instinct had once drawn them to each other across any room they both occupied. She saw something cross his face that was gone again almost before she could name it. Not merely recognition, but a kind of grief, so old and so carefully controlled that she understood, in that single, unguarded instant, that whatever had driven him away 5 years ago had not been resolved by his father's death, nor by 5 years of war, nor by any medal Lord Wellington himself might have pinned to his coat. He crossed the room toward her party with the slow, deliberate courtesy of a man determined to give the assembled county nothing to whisper about, and bowed first to her father, correctly, formally, and her father, Rosalind saw it clearly, though she doubted anyone else in that crowded room marked it, went very pale, and did not, for a long moment, offer his hand. "Your Grace," Gideon said, "I had hoped we might speak, before too long, of certain matters concerning my father's estate. There are papers I have lately come into possession of that I believe touch upon a debt this county has owed my family for some years now. A debt, I think, that only you are in a position to fully discharge." The Duke of Wraxall's face in the candlelight had gone the colour of old ash. "I do not know," he said, his voice carefully level, "what papers you imagine yourself to possess, Lord Rothwell, but I would counsel you, as a friend of your late father's, to consider very carefully before you make public whatever you believe you have found." "I have considered very little else," Gideon said. "For 5 years, Your Grace, in a country a very great distance from this one. I find my patience for further consideration has very nearly run its course." He turned then, before the Duke could answer, and bowed to Rosalind with a formality so at odds with the warmth she had once known in him that it struck her almost like a blow. "Lady Rosalind," he said, "you are looking well. I understand I am to wish you happy, on your understanding with Lord Harcourt." "You may," she said, echoing without quite meaning to the very words she had once used to greet another unwelcome betrothal announcement in a different story she did not yet know she was living. "If you find you are able to mean it." Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of an old tenderness he had not expected to feel again so soon, standing in a public ballroom with half the county watching. "I have never yet said anything to you, Lady Rosalind, that I did not entirely mean," he said quietly, "and I do not intend to begin the practice of insincerity tonight, whatever the room expects of us both." Before she could answer, before Harcourt, bristling at her side, could interject the sharp word she saw forming on his lips, a sound rose from the doorway of the assembly room. A commotion, raised voices, a woman's cry cutting through the general murmur of 60 conversations, and then a single word, shouted by someone Rosalind could not yet see, that brought the entire room to a sudden, frozen silence. "Fire! Rothwell Hall is afire!" Enjoying Rosalind and Gideon's story so far? If that cliffhanger got your heart racing, vote/like this chapter and drop a comment below telling me what you think Gideon will find in the ashes. Your support helps this story reach more readers. The ride to Rothwell Hall took 11 minutes at a gallop, through lanes still rutted with March mud, and Rosalind made it in Gideon's wake before Harcourt or her father had so much as called for the carriage, riding pillion behind old Josiah Bramwell, the Wraxall stablemaster, who had thrown a saddle onto the fastest hunter in the stable, the instant the cry of fire went up, and had not paused to ask whether a duke's daughter ought to be riding through a burning night in a ball gown. "You'll ruin the silk, my lady," Bramwell said, not unkindly, as they came over the rise and saw the glow of Rothwell Hall's east wing lighting the whole valley a furious orange. "The silk," Rosalind said, is the least of what may be ruined tonight. The scene that met them was chaos, given shape. Villagers and tenants forming a bucket line from the ornamental pond. The Rothwell grooms leading terrified horses out of a stable block, dangerously close to the flames. And Gideon himself, coat already discarded, directing the effort with the same clipped, unshakable authority Rosalind imagined he had once used to hold a line of infantry steady under Spanish artillery fire. He did not falter, did not raise his voice beyond what was needed to be heard over the roar of the blaze, and it was watching him in that firelight. Utterly composed, utterly present, nothing left in him of the bitter, wounded boy who had once told her he had no name worth waiting for. That Rosalind understood, with a certainty that arrived all at once rather than gradually, that whatever she had spent 5 years teaching herself not to feel, had not, in fact, gone anywhere at all. "The East Wing is my father's old study," Gideon said when he saw her. Water and soot streaked across his face, surprise and something warmer flickering behind his eyes before duty reclaimed him. "There are papers there I cannot lose. Rosalind, Lady Rosalind, if you mean to stay, make yourself useful and keep the little Fenwick girl from running back toward the stables. She's tried it twice already." She did as she was told, and it was, strangely, the most useful she had felt in months. They saved the wing, in the end, though barely. The fire had been caught early enough, and the stone construction of the older part of the house resisted it long enough for the bucket lines and a fortunate shift of wind to do their work. But the study itself was gutted, its shelves collapsed, its papers scattered and half consumed, and it was among that wreckage, near dawn, soot-blackened and exhausted, that Gideon knelt and drew out from beneath a fallen beam a scorched leather portfolio that made him go very still. "This is not mine," he said quietly, turning it over in blackened hands. "I have never seen this case in my life, but I know that seal." He looked up at Rosalind, something cold moving behind his exhaustion. "It is your father's." Dr. Fenn, summoned before first light to tend to 2 grooms burned attempting to save the stable roof, found the Duke of Wraxall waiting for him in the Rothwell stable yard when he arrived, pale, unslept, and, the physician noted with the particular clinical alarm of a man who had attended the Duke for 20 years, breathing with a shallowness that had nothing to do with smoke. "You ought not to have ridden out in this cold, your Grace, at your age and with your heart the way it is," Fenn said bluntly, taking his pulse without waiting to be asked. "Whatever business brought you here tonight could surely have waited for daylight." "It could not," the Duke said, "though I begin to think it has waited a good deal too long already." He did not explain further, and Fenn, who had learned decades before which of his patients could be pressed and which could not, did not ask. It was Rosalind who found her father an hour later, standing alone at the edge of the ruined East Wing, staring at the wreckage with an expression she had never before seen him wear. Not the careful public dignity of a county magistrate, but something closer to a man watching his own past, finally, irrevocably catch fire. "Father," she said, "Lord Rothwell found a case among the ashes. He says it bears your seal." The Duke closed his eyes. "Then I suppose," he said, "there is very little use in my continuing to deny what I rode out here 3 nights ago to prevent anyone from ever finding." He told her the whole of it there, in the cold grey light of a spring morning, with the smell of smoke still thick in the air, and the Rothwell servants moving wearily among the wreckage behind them, and Rosalind listened with a growing, sick understanding that the story she had been told all her life, of a disgraced earl and a scandal properly investigated, had never been the true one at all. "Your Uncle Edward," the Duke said. For Rosalind had a dim memory of an uncle who had died young, some years before her own birth, spoken of rarely and never at length. Held a commission in the county militia alongside the elder Lord Rothwell, and it was Edward, not Ashworth, who diverted the funds meant for provisioning that regiment into debts of his own that would otherwise have ruined this family's name in a single season. When the discrepancy was discovered, Edward came to me half mad with terror, and I, God forgive me, Rosalind, I let Ashworth's greater public standing and Edward's private, desperate pleading persuade me that a quiet arrangement might spare us both. Ashworth agreed to accept the blame in exchange for a settlement that would secure his own son's, Gideon's, future income regardless of the scandal, believing, I think, that his reputation could survive disgrace better than mine, could survive the ruin of my own brother's name, and better than the county could survive the scandal of two great families falling at once. He was wrong. It broke him within 2 years, and I have lived with that wrongness every day since, dressed up in the comfortable clothes of a magistrate's public dignity, telling myself that what was done could not now be undone without ruining everyone a second time. And Edward died the following winter of a fever, still owing the truth to a man who had already paid for his silence with everything he had left to give. Rosalind stood very still, feeling the whole architecture of her childhood rearrange itself around this single, terrible fact. Every closed door in her father's study, every flinch at the name Rothwell, every careful silence at the dinner table these 5 years past, suddenly reordering themselves into a pattern she had been too dutiful or too frightened to ever question. You let Gideon's father die believing the world's contempt was something he had earned. You let Gideon leave this county believing his own name worthless and go to a war he did not particularly need to fight, carrying a disgrace that was never his to carry. I did, the Duke said, and there was no defense in his voice, only a terrible, exhausted honesty. I told myself in the beginning that it was a temporary arrangement, that Edward would find some way to repay what he had taken, and Ashworth's good name would be quietly restored once the regimental accounts were settled. Then Edward died, and there was no one left to repay anything, and restoring Ashworth's name would have meant confessing my own family's guilt in his place. And I found, when the moment came to choose, that I loved my own comfort a great deal more than I had ever imagined I could love a lie. You loved your own comfort, Rosalind repeated, more than you loved the truth, or your daughter's happiness, or a good man's life. Yes, her father said simply. I have had a great many years now to regret the ordering of those loves, and I find regret, in the end, purchases nothing at all. It only waits patiently for a night such as this one to finally collect what it is owed. I let a great many things happen that I now cannot undo, her father said, and I came here 3 nights ago meaning to retrieve the last written proof of it. A ledger in Edward's own hand, which I have kept hidden these 15 years in the old estate boathouse that both families once shared as children, thinking I might finally destroy it and let the whole matter rest quietly in its grave, alongside every other Wraxall silence. I could not, in the end, bring myself to burn it. I hid it instead, in that case, in Ashworth's old study, telling myself I would decide its fate later, like the coward I have always been in this single matter. He looked toward the ruin. It seems fate, or something rather less poetic than fate, has decided to burn it for me after all. It was Viscount Harcourt, arriving at Rothwell that same morning under the pretext of concern for the Duke's welfare, who found Rosalind first among the ruins and drew her aside with an urgency that had nothing at all to do with concern. I know what that case contains, he said quietly. My own father has spoken of it, in his cups more than once these past years. He was the county official who signed off on the militia inquiry, Rosalind, and he has always known precisely whose hand truly emptied that regimental strongbox. If this comes out now, it will not only ruin your father, it will ruin mine and very likely drag my whole family's name down with it. On the eve of an election, he has spent a decade positioning himself to win. Then, perhaps, Rosalind said, it is time both our fathers answered for what they have spent 15 years avoiding. Perhaps, Harcourt said, but I find I am not so generous as to let my own future be sacrificed to your sudden fit of conscience. Marry me within the month, as arranged, and I give you my word I will use whatever influence my family retains to see this whole matter quietly settled without further scandal to either house. Delay or refuse me now of all moments, and I promise you I will let the full weight of what my father knows fall exactly where it will do the most damage. To your father, to Lord Rothwell's family a second time, and to whatever remains of your own good name once the county learns you spent the small hours of this morning riding pillion through a burning night to reach another man's house. You would ruin us all, Rosalind said, rather than release me honourably from an understanding I no longer wish to keep. I would remind you, Harcourt said with a coldness she had never before heard from him, that honour, Lady Rosalind, has always been a luxury afforded only to those who can survive its cost. I find I cannot, this particular morning, afford it, and I do not believe you can either. Don't miss what happens next. Harcourt just showed his true colours. Follow, subscribe, so you don't miss the next update, and share this story with a friend who loves a slow burn, forbidden romance. She found Gideon an hour later in what remained of his father's study, sifting through the wreckage with his own hands, and told him everything. Her father's confession, Harcourt's threat, the whole rotten architecture of 15 years' silence, finally cracking open around them both. I do not know what to do, she admitted, with a truth this large, in a house already on fire. Gideon was quiet a long moment, turning a fragment of scorched paper over in his blackened fingers. My father died, he said, believing the whole world had rightly judged him a thief and a coward, when he was in fact the single most honourable man I have ever known. A man who ruined himself rather than let a friend's brother's disgrace destroy two families at once. I have spent 5 years in a war I did not particularly wish to survive, telling myself that whatever I found on my return, I would at least have the comfort of certainty. I find instead that I have only more grief, and a case full of half-burned proof, and you, standing in the ashes of my father's study, telling me you have been asked to buy my family's ruin at the price of your own future. He looked up at her, and something in his controlled soldier's composure finally, visibly, broke. I do not know what to do either, Rosalind. I know only that I am done watching people I love pay for other men's silences, and I do not intend to let it happen again, not to my father's memory, and not to you. Then we had better decide together, she said, before Harcourt or my father decides it for us. He reached out then for the first time in 5 years and took her soot-blackened hand in his, and neither of them remarked upon how naturally it fit there, as though 5 years and a war and an ocean had merely been a long, unnecessary detour back to the exact place they had always been meant to stand. Whatever comes of tonight, Gideon said, whatever my father's name costs your family to restore, I find I would rather face it honestly, at your side, than spend 1 more year of my life pretending a silence bought at another man's ruin could ever be mistaken for peace. Then let us go and end it, Rosalind said, properly tonight, before either of our fathers finds some new way to postpone what has already waited far too long. That evening, The whole of Wraxall Park's household assembled in uneasy anticipation in the great drawing-room. The Duke, ashen and unsteady, insisting despite Dr. Fenn's objections that he was fit to receive visitors. The Duchess, white-faced with a fear she did not yet fully understand, for her husband had told her nothing of the night's revelations, only that certain old matters must at last be settled before the household could know peace again. Harcourt arrived early and positioned deliberately near the fire as though staking a claim to the room itself, his expression composed into the same careful blandness he wore to every county assembly, though his eyes moved constantly toward the door. And Gideon, entering last, the scorched ledger in his own hands at last, having ridden straight from Rothwell's ruins without pausing even to change his soot-stained coat, Rosalind at his side in a gown she had not troubled to change either, both of them bearing quite visibly the marks of the night just past. Miss Prentice, the old governess, stood near the door with Mrs. Dunmore, the housekeeper, neither of them able to account afterward for exactly why they had felt it necessary to be present, only that the whole house seemed to understand, without being told, that something long buried was finally about to surface. It was Reverend Thomas Wren, the elderly village priest who had buried the elder Lord Rothwell 5 years before, and who arrived, unannounced and breathless, moments after Gideon, who brought the final, unlooked-for turn. "I have carried a letter in my keeping these 5 years," the Reverend said, "given to me by the dying Earl of Rothwell himself, with strict instruction that it be opened only upon the death of Master Edward Wraxall, or the public revival of the militia matter, whichever should come first. I confess I had begun to hope neither occasion would ever arrive. I see now that I was wrong to hope it, for silence, I think, has done rather more damage to this county than the truth, however painful, could ever have managed on its own." He drew a sealed letter from within his coat, his hands trembling with age and with the visible weight of what he carried. "With your Grace's permission, I believe the hour has finally come to open it." The Duke, seated by the fire, went whiter still, and pressed one hand to his chest. "Read it, then," he said, "before I lose whatever courage I have left to hear it." Reverend Wren broke the seal, and had read no further than the letter's first trembling line. "I write this in the full knowledge of my innocence and another man's guilt, which I have chosen to bear for reasons I pray my son will one day understand and forgive." When a sharp, terrible sound broke from the Duke's chest, and he pitched forward from his chair onto the drawing-room floor, unmoving as the Duchess's scream brought the whole house running. That ending, though, greater than, "If you gasped out loud, leave a comment and let me know. And if you're new here, turn on notifications so you catch the next chapter the moment it goes live." The Duke did not die that night, though it was 3 days before Dr. Fenn would permit visitors beyond the Duchess and Rosalind into the darkened bedchamber where he lay, his heart having given warning rather than final judgment, and it was on the 4th morning, propped against pillows with the pale, chastened look of a man who has been granted an unexpected second reckoning, that he asked for Gideon to be brought to him. "I meant to make my confession from a chair by my own fire, like a man of some remaining dignity," the Duke said when Gideon stood at last beside his bed. "And instead, I collapsed like a felled tree before I had spoken a single word of it. I understand Reverend Wren finished what I could not. I understand also that there is little dignity left for me to salvage in either version of the story. My father's letter names Edward Wraxall plainly," Gideon said, "and clears my father's memory beyond any further question. The Reverend has already sworn its authenticity before witnesses. Whatever dignity remains to be salvaged here, Your Grace, is not, I think, mine to grant or withhold. It belongs to the county and to my father's grave, and to however you mean to spend whatever years Dr. Fenn's warning has now left you. Then tell me plainly, Colonel, since you have earned the right to plain speaking 100 times over these past 5 years, can such a wrong as mine ever truly be forgiven, or only endured? Gideon considered this a long moment, standing at the bedside of the man who had let his father die in disgrace to protect a dead brother's memory. I do not know, he said finally, whether forgiveness and endurance are, in the end, so very different from one another. I know only that I intend to marry your daughter, Your Grace, with or without your blessing. For her sake, if not for my own, to begin that marriage without a war still raging between our two houses. The Duke, to Gideon's considerable surprise, laughed, a weak, wondering sound, but a genuine one. You have your father's exact turn of phrase, he said. He once told me, the week before the scandal broke, that he would rather lose every acre he owned than spend one more year at war with a neighbour over a matter neither of us would even remember correctly in 10 years' time. I did not listen to him then. I find I have no further excuse for failing to listen now. The public reckoning, when it came, was neither so violent nor so total as either family had feared. The Reverend's letter, read formally before the county's assembled magistrates within the fortnight, restored the elder Lord Rothwell's name in full, and the Duke of Wraxall, to the considerable shock of a county that had expected him to fight the revelation with every resource his rank afforded. Instead rose before that same assembly and confirmed every particular of it himself, adding only, in a voice that did not waver though his hand visibly did, that the fault of concealment had been entirely his own, and that Colonel Ashworth's family had suffered a wrong for which no settlement of income could ever have been adequate payment. It cost him something, that public admission. Old friendships grew cooler. His standing as magistrate was quietly, gently retired in favour of a younger man the following year. But it cost him a great deal less, Rosalind thought, watching him afterward in the carriage home, than 15 more years of the silence that had already so nearly cost him his own heart. Viscount Harcourt's threats in the end proved considerably less durable than his father's political ambitions. For once the truth was public and confirmed by the Duke's own admission, the elder Harcourt's complicity in signing off on a falsified inquiry became, rather than a private threat to be wielded, a public liability of his own making, and the family withdrew from the county's political contests entirely within the year. The son's engagement to Rosalind quietly, mutually dissolved before the scandal could attach itself further to either name. Harcourt himself, to his credit, called once at Wraxall Park before departing for his mother's family in Ireland, and told Rosalind, with something almost like honesty, that he hoped she might one day forgive him the ungenerous shape his fear had taken, though he did not, he admitted, expect it soon. I forgive you already, Rosalind told him, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. Almost there. The truth is finally out. Now for the payoff you've been waiting for. If you'd like to see more historical romance like this, please rate this story and consider adding it to your library so you can easily find it again. They were married at the small parish church at Amesbury in June, 3 months after the fire, with Rothwell Hall's east wing still under careful reconstruction and the scent of new-cut hay drifting through the open church doors from the fields beyond. Reverend Wren performed the ceremony himself, his hands steadier that morning than they had been in years, and paused at the reading of the vows to look meaningfully toward the back pew where the elder Lord Rothwell's memory, restored now beyond any further dispute, seemed almost to sit among the witnesses. The Duke of Wraxall, walking his daughter down the aisle with the careful, deliberate steps of a man whose heart Dr. Fenn still watched with daily concern, wept openly and without shame. and the Duchess, seated in the front pew, held her husband's empty seat beside her, with a tenderness that told Rosalind, watching, that whatever else her parents' marriage had survived, it had not survived unchanged. And perhaps, she thought, watching her mother's face, it had survived rather better for having finally been made honest. Josiah Bramwell led the wedding carriage's matched greys himself, refusing to let any younger groom take the reins for so important a journey. Mrs. Dunmore wept into her handkerchief through the entire register signing, and Sally, promoted now to lady's maid, pronounced the whole affair, in the strictest confidence to the rest of the servants' hall, the finest wedding Wiltshire had seen in a generation. Gideon rebuilt Rothwell Hall's east wing that autumn, and had the old study, where his father's ruin had first been sealed and where, years later, the truth of it had finally, painfully, burned free. Rebuilt not as a study at all, but as a library, its shelves stocked new, its walls hung with a single portrait of the elder Lord Rothwell, restored to its rightful place of honour, so that anyone who entered it afterward would find, first and always, the face of a man whose name the whole county now spoke, at last, with nothing but respect. On the evening of their wedding day, standing together at the edge of the same rose garden where a bitter, grieving young man had once told a heartbroken girl he had no name left worth waiting for, Gideon took Rosalind's hand and said, "I find I have finally run out of reasons not to ask you properly." "Then ask," she said. "Will you wait for me, Rosalind? Not for some ghost of the man I once was, nor for whatever name this county now chooses to give me, but simply for the rest of whatever ordinary, unremarkable years we are fortunate enough to be given." "I have been waiting," she said, "since I was 18 years old, and I find I have not once, in all that time, regretted it." The roses that June were only just beginning to bud, pale green against the old grey wall, and neither of them doubted, watching the last light fail gently over Wraxall Park's long lawns, that they would bloom, this year and every year after, in a garden that belonged at last entirely to the truth.